for example, let's say there's something going on at your workplace and you need to object to it because it's driving you crazy, and you talk it over with your wife so that you've got your head screwed on straight. You say, oh, I've got to say something. And you go there and you say something, and you're stumbling and awkward and all of that. But you watch the response, and maybe you get what you're aiming at, maybe you don't. But you've learned a bunch. You've learned, well, I'm not as coherent as I could be. I'm not as good at putting my arguments together. My boss is more of a son of a bitch than he thought he was. This is a worse problem than I knew about. It's like differentiated. So now the landscape is higher resolution, and so are you. Well, so good. So maybe you're a little bit better prepared the next time you have to do that. And so the issue here, to some degree, is don't lose an opportunity to grapple with something that objects to you, especially when the objection is rather small. Because that's something you say, well, I can put up with it. It's like, fair enough, like you don't want to make everything into a war. I usually use a rule of 3. If we're interacting and you do something that I find disruptive, I'll note it. It's like, potential dragon, gone. And I leave it be. And then if you do it again, I think, oh yeah, that probably wasn't merely situational, but I'll leave it be because that's still not enough evidence. But if you do it a third time, then I'll say, hey, I just noticed this. And you'll say, no, that didn't happen. And I'll say, yeah, not only did it happen, but it happened here and it happened here, and I'm not making this up. So there's something going on here, like I'm not ignoring it, and we can get to the bottom of it. And then they'll come up with a bunch of objections about why that isn't necessary, and you push those aside, and they'll come up with more objections, and they'll push those aside, and then usually they'll get mad or burst into tears, and if you push that aside, then you get to have a conversation. Right, and then you can solve the problem. But man, you got to be a monster, because first of all, you need 6 arguments about why their objections aren't going to stop you, and then you have to not be intimidated by the anger, and you have to not be swamped by compassion about the tears. And then you can have a conversation. And people don't do that. They won't do that. And so they don't solve the problems. And so then the problems accrue. Right? And if they accrue over 15 years of a relationship, then they end up fat, ugly, and in divorce court. So, and that's not a great outcome. It's divorce court and cancer are similar in their seriousness. Not always, but sufficiently often. So when that error emerges, it's a glimmering. Now, we talked a lot about the hierarchical structure of goals, And so here's something to think about. So the thing that announces itself as error has a twofold nature. That's because it's chaos and order at the same time. Or it's because it's all the archetypal structures at the same time. It's the dragon of chaos, it's the great mother, positive and negative, it's the great father, positive and negative, it's the individual, hero and adversary. All of that manifests itself in the moment of error. Right? The archetypes come forward. Did you make an error because you're a bad person? Could be. Now, so one of the things to think about with regards to that is, in the Mesopotamian creation story, when Tiamat comes flooding back, it's so interesting, that story. You think about what she does. So she's the archetype of error, let's say, the error that can take you out, that can dissolve you in salt water. Tears. Well, she's irritated because Apsu was destroyed, so the structure is gone. Carelessness has destroyed the structure. Up comes Tiamat. She's not happy. What does she do? She prepares a phalanx of monsters. It's exactly what the story says. She produces a whole horde of monsters to come at you. And she puts Kingu at their head. And Kingu is the king of the monsters. And later, so he's the ultimate bad guy. He's Satan for all intents and purposes. In the Mesopotamian version, it's out of him that Marduk makes human beings. It's out of his blood that Marduk makes human beings. That's a critical issue, man. The Mesopotamians said, imagine the worst monster you can possibly imagine. The king of all the monsters. That's the blood of human beings. Wow. So what does that mean? Well, it means that one of the terrible things that lurks, let's say that you've been in a long-term relationship and it collapses. Let's say you had a tendency towards alcoholism, you weren't so great with regards to your drug use, you're not that conscientious, and you had like 4 or 5 kind of low rent affairs, and you know it. Your marriage collapses. Bang. Well, who do you first meet when you fall into chaos? You meet King of the Monsters, and he's you. It's like, why did my marriage fall apart? What did I do wrong? Bang, 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 bang. I did all these things wrong. Why? Because that thing inhabits me. What is it? Well, that's the most horrifying question, right? Well, that's why. So down there in the archetypal space, all these things lurk. The hero and the adversary. Well, you've just met the adversary, right? Well, maybe you were a tyrant. That's certainly possible. Maybe everything around you was chaotic. So what do you encounter when things fall apart? You encounter the adversary, you encounter the tyrant, you encounter the catastrophe of nature, and you encounter the dragon of the chaos. And they're all intermingled. You have to sort that out. That's what happens to Ellis when she goes down the rabbit hole, right? She meets the Red Queen. And the Red Queen is always running around. Off with their heads, off with their heads. And she says, in my kingdom, you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. Right? Down the rabbit hole, you meet the archetypes. And so, okay, so back to responsibility. Well, one of the things Solzhenitsyn detailed, he said, well, how do societies go corrupt? He said, it's easy. One little sin at a time. You go to work, someone's lording it over you, you know that they're tyrannical, you don't have the wherewithal to stand up. It's like, okay, you're a slave. And so if you continue to agree to be a slave, you will continue to generate tyrants. Right? And the only thing that can stop you from doing that, I think, is the right kind of terror. It's like, be careful what you give up. Because, and that's this logos. Okay, so all right, so that's this logos. The logos is the thing that enables you to mediate between order and chaos. And maybe you have to have some faith in that. It's like, well, what should you do if someone is harassing you? Well, you should fight back. Okay, what is that? What's the most effective way to fight back? Well, sometimes it's physical, but that's not necessarily for the best. Maybe it's through articulation. Maybe it's through analysis, right? You want to be sharp. You want to be able to decompose a problem. You want to be able to formulate an argument and a counter response. And maybe you want to be so good at that that people don't mess with you to begin with. And then you're a perfectly articulate counter monster and you never have to take your sword out. That's the place that you want to be. It's like people should know after 3 seconds of interacting with you that harassing you will be a seriously bad idea. And then you'll have a perfectly fine time with them. So, and that's part of, so there's some utility in meeting the devil in the underworld, right? Because maybe he's got something to teach you. That's certainly possible. And one of the things that you can be taught is that your normative morality, which is basically your harmlessness and your naivety masquerading as virtue, is completely insufficient to protect you in the world, especially against the sorts of things that you're talking about, which are tyranny. Tyrants will push until you push back. It's in their nature. They don't have internal controls. So they just push and push and push and push and push and push. Even kids do that. Like little kids do that all the time. They'll just push you until they hit a wall. They're actually quite happy when they hit a wall because the last thing a child wants is a universe without walls. It terrifies them, right? They want to see, well, I'm in a swimming pool. There's an edge. They don't want to see, this isn't a swimming pool. This is an ocean. I'm in the middle of an ocean. I'm going to drown. That's a terrible thing for children. That's why they need discipline and structure, because it's consistency and predictability and routine and all the things that are extraordinarily helpful. Well, books are interesting. Some aren't. Often I dog-ear the pages of books that I'm reading if I find a line or something, that I'd like to remember that I think is important. And, I have some books on my shelves, like pages are dog-eared double because there was a really amazing thought on one page and there was a really amazing thought on the other page, the facing page. And so the whole damn thing is just nothing but dog ears. And then there's other books where there's zero. When I read Nietzsche, for example, there was lots of dog ears on Beyond Good and Evil, which is a great book. And Nietzsche actually, he came up with the most arrogant statement anybody ever made about himself as an author.
which is really quite impressive. To come up with the most arrogant statement, that's really something. And he was great at coming up with one-liners, philosophical one-liners. He said, I can write in a sentence what it takes other people a book to write. And then he said, that they can't even write in a book. So that's pretty good, eh? It's like arrogant, and then he topped it. It's like, yes, this is a man who could really write. Anyways, the problem with reading a book like that, Beyond Good and Evil say, is that every damn sentence is a thought, and a deep thought. And so reading Beyond Good and Evil, it's like just constantly being punched. I mean, partly you're punched because you read part of it and you don't know what the hell he says, and so then you're stupid, and so that's a punch. And then now and then you stumble across something you understand, and it's like, it's hard on you. He said he philosophized with a hammer, that he was breaking things apart, and there's no doubt about that. So now and then you run across something you understand, and then that breaks you apart because you understand it, and it takes a long time to go through the book because you have to think about it, and God, that's not good. Thinking about things, well, it isn't, because when you think about, you already know everything in some sense. You've got a map that covers the whole world, which is sort of why you can function. And so as long as everything's going fine, you don't really have to adjust your map, and you don't have to think. But then if you come across something that makes you think, then what that means is that part of the way you were thinking was wrong. And so when you think something, when you're forced to, then some little part of what you were, or your map, the way you represent the world, it has to die because it was wrong. And then it has to be replaced by this new thing. And God only knows how much of what it was that was there has to die. That's part of the magnitude of error problem. And so people don't like to think. And so it's hard to read difficult books like Beyond Good and Evil because you're just forced to think, and it's just exhausting. You wish that he would just go away, which is why they're trying to not teach difficult books in universities anymore, so that people don't have to undergo the difficult process of actually having to think and transform themselves. Anyway.